Welcome to the deep dive. Today, you've brought us some really quite compelling and frankly disturbing material.
Yeah, it's definitely heavy stuff.
We're going to be looking at a pretty pivotal moment in the history of mental health practices, specifically the story of Chelmsford Private Hospital.
Right, and then how that connects to the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, or CCHR.
Exactly. We'll explore their mission sort of in light of what happened at Chelmsford and, well, other similar events.
The goal really is to understand the crucial details of Chelmsford, what actually happened, and then see how that might provide context for CCHR's formation and their ongoing work.
Okay, let's dive right in.
What's fascinating and deeply unsettling is how a place meant for healing could become the source of so much harm.
Hmm.
And to really get why CCHR emerged and why they often have such strong criticisms of psychiatry, we really need to unpack what went down at Chelmsford.
Totally agree. So let's set the scene. We're going back to 1963, Pennant Hills, Sydney, Australia.
Right. That's where Chelmsford Private Hospital was established.
Yeah.
By a psychiatrist named Dr. Harry Bailey.
Now, looking through the sources you shared, it becomes clear pretty quickly this wasn't just any hospital. It became notorious for some really controversial treatments.
And controversial is putting it mildly. We're not just talking slightly unconventional methods here.
No.
We're talking about practices that were, well, highly questionable even then, and ultimately devastating for a lot of patients.
So what were the main ones?
The two big ones that really stand out are deep sleep therapy, DST, and electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, often used together.
Deep sleep therapy.
Uh-huh.
Okay, the name itself, it sounds almost gentle, doesn't it?
It does, deceptively so.
Right.
But the reality, as the sources make clear, was just horrific.
How so?
Well, it involved putting patients into this prolonged, coma state, using heavy drug sedation,
For how long?
sometimes for weeks. And often, while they were in this state, they'd administer repeated electroconvulsive therapy.
Weeks. Wow, that's hard to imagine. And one source links DST directly to, what, 48 patient deaths in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, a staggering number. And by 1979, the total deaths linked to the hospital were over 24. I mean, just think about that scale in one private hospital.
It's truly shocking. It really makes you wonder about the oversight, the regulations.
Exactly. It underscores the potential for harm when treatments lack solid scientific backing and, proper checks and balances. ECT existed, sure, but this aggressive combination with prolonged sedation, that was far from standard practice, raises huge ethical questions.
It's difficult to grasp what patients went through, but some accounts are just harrowing. There's one from an unidentified woman recalling being tied down, naked, experiencing lights in her head during ECT. Another source describes the ECT itself just starkly, 110 volts for 3 seconds through the frontal lobes.
Brutal, just brutal. And these weren't isolated stories. The consistency in the accounts, plus that death toll, it points to systemic failure.
Yeah, a complete lack of patient protection, it seems. What strikes me is the sheer vulnerability.
Totally. Sedated, unable to communicate, subjected to these incredibly invasive procedures.
And what makes it even worse is that initially there was no accountability. Complaints came in from patients, from families.
Right. But the early coronial inquests, they found no case against Dr. Bailey. Astonishing, really.
It's like their suffering was just dismissed, ignored by the system meant to protect them.
That initial failure, it really highlights the danger when medical authority goes unchecked, especially inside institutions.
Absolutely. And it shows why external scrutiny, which CCHR later pushed for, is so vital.
That lack of accountability early on is key. The power dynamics just seem stacked against the patients.
But things did start to change, didn't they? It seems the media and activists really stepped up.
Yeah, thankfully. The Sydney Morning Herald started publishing articles way back in 1967, raising concerns.
Right, I saw that. And then editorials, TV broadcasts.
And the Chelmsford Victims Action Group. They were crucial, campaigning relentlessly for an inquiry.
It really shows the power of, public awareness in the press when the official channels fail.
Absolutely. The media's persistence was key in breaking through that silence, giving victims a voice, creating pressure.
So we've got these awful treatments, the initial cover-up, essentially.
Yeah.
But then the media and activists start pushing back hard.
Right. And that sustained pressure eventually worked.
Leading to the Royal Commission in 1988.
Yep. The Royal Commission into the treatment of patients at Chelmsford. A huge step. John Patrick Slattery, a retired Supreme Court judge, chaired it.
That must have felt like a turning point for the victims and families, a formal acknowledgement.
Definitely. Hoped that the truth would finally come out.
And the commission's findings, they actually had teeth, led to real changes.
They did. The Medical Practitioners Amendment Bill in '87 came directly out of it.
Which brought in better ways to investigate complaints against doctors.
Exactly. Improved disciplinary structures.
Eh.
And crucially, it recommended coroners be told immediately about deaths in private psychiatric hospitals.
Seems like basic safeguards, doesn't it? Clearly missing before.
Very basic. So these laws were a direct result, an attempt to learn from Chelmsford and prevent it happening again. Mandatory death reporting, increasing transparency.
And the findings themselves, the sources say they were scorching.
Yeah, indicating severe criticism. And much later, in 2020, a federal court judgment upheld those findings.
Using incredibly strong language, too. Calling DST a psychiatric horror, mentioning murder, deaths, negligence, unethical and medical malpractice.
Decades later, yes, but such a powerful legal condemnation, it really underlines the gravity of it all.
What happened to Dr. Bailey in the end?
Well, tragically, he died by suicide, just before a deregistration hearing in 1986.
And the rest of the medical team? Any criminal charges?
Surprisingly, no. No criminal charges against the wider team.
Really?
Yeah. Although later on, 2 former DST doctors actually tried to sue a publisher over a book about Chelmsford.
How did that go?
They lost. And the judge made a really important point. Said they couldn't just suspend their own medical judgment because Bailey was well known.
Ah, so emphasizing individual responsibility.
Exactly. Each doctor has that duty of care, regardless of who's in charge.
One last thing on Chelmsford. The sources mention long delays in disciplinary action against the other doctors involved.
Yeah, that's another troubling aspect. It
Right.
took years. And arguments were even made that the delays themselves were an abusive process.
Just compounding the injustice for the families.
It seems that way. A protracted, frustrating process for them.
Okay, so we have this incredibly disturbing history at Chelmsford. Tragedy, a long fight for accountability.
A clear example of major failures within the system.
And it's against this backdrop, this context, that this other organization emerges with a very critical view of psychiatry, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights.
Right. The timing is significant. CCHR was established in 1969.
By the Church of Scientology, according to the sources.
Correct. With the stated goal to investigate and expose psychiatric violations of human rights and to clean up the field of mental healing.
And they're now global, over 250 chapters.
Yeah, quite widespread. And it's worth noting, as one source points out, Scientology's founder, L. Ron Hubbard, was very anti-psychiatry, wanted to keep Scientology separate from it.
And their connection to Chelmsford specifically, it seems pretty direct.
Very direct. CCHR Australia was registered around '74, and they worked closely with a nurse from Chelmsford, Rosa Nicholson.
She was a Scientologist.
Yes. And she smuggled patient files out of the hospital. Brave move.
Wow. That must have been critical evidence.
Absolutely. Evidence about DST and other practices in the late '70s. It contributed to DST finally being stopped in 1979.
And the federal court later even mentioned attempts to dismiss the Royal Commission's findings as just a Scientology CCHR version.
Yeah, which shows how involved CCHR was and maybe how controversial their involvement was seen by some.
So Rosa Nicholson's courage, CCHR's role, it's a significant part of the Chelmsford story.
Undeniably. Regardless of how you view CCHR overall, their role in exposing Chelmsford is part of the record.
So given that history, what's CCHR's core mission now? What are they focused on?
Well, looking at their documents, a central theme is challenging what they call fraudulent use of subjective psychiatric diagnoses.
Meaning they don't think the diagnoses are scientifically sound.
Pretty much. They argue these diagnoses lack a solid scientific basis, like objective tests.
And they believe these diagnoses are used to justify what?
Harmful treatments, in their view. Things like mind-altering drugs, ECT, and they suggest financial gain is sometimes a motive. They advocate for a workable and humane mental health system instead.
So deep skepticism about the foundations of mainstream psychiatry.
Fundamentally, yes. They question the validity of many diagnoses and treatments, especially the lack of biological markers for many conditions, and worry about the influence of drug companies.
And they're actively campaigning on these issues today.
Oh, yeah. Their submissions detail campaigns to protect kids from restraint, electroshock, psychosurgery.
They also opposed some draft laws, right, about children consenting to treatments.
That's right. They opposed mental health bills, proposing kids could consent to sterilization, electroshock, psychosurgery without parental consent. A very strong stance on children's rights and parental involvement.
That reflects their broader concern about irreversible interventions, especially for minors.
Definitely. They're also critical of screening very young children, like 3 or 4-year-olds, for mental health issues.
And the role of schools.
Yeah, they see schools becoming a gateway to the mental health system. They question the screening tools and point to pharmaceutical funding influencing psychiatric groups and doctors.
That ties into the other documents you shared, focusing on potential overprescription and industry influence.
Right? CCHR is very critical of early intervention programs, school screening, arguing it can lead to overdiagnosis, unnecessary medicalization, possibly driven by commercial interests.
What about older kids? Adolescents?
They're skeptical about early intervention for psychosis, too. They point to low prediction accuracy, like who will actually develop psychosis.
And the risk of unnecessary treatment with powerful drugs.
Exactly. And they highlight the rising rates of psychiatric drug prescriptions overall for kids, even infants. These are serious points people are debating.
Yeah, definitely raises complex ethical questions.
For sure. And beyond specific campaigns, CCHR challenges core psychiatric ideas.
Like the chemical imbalance theory.
Precisely. They argue there aren't objective tests to prove it in a living person's brain. They stress the harmful side effects of meds, tardive dyskinesia, neuroleptic malignant syndrome.
And the diagnostic manuals, like the DSM?
They see them as subjective, based on consensus, not objective science. One source even quotes a psychiatrist calling the DSM an arrogant fraud. Shows the debate exists within the field, too.
So it's a fundamental critique of the biological model that dominates psychiatry.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They emphasize potential harms from drugs and question diagnoses based mainly on reported symptoms, not measurable biology.
Finally, they also focus on actual crime and abuse within the system.
Yes, things like billing fraud, sexual abuse of patients. They run that website, psychcrime.org, tracking convicted mental health workers.
And they argue for external policing of the mental health system.
Correct. They don't believe self-regulation works effectively given the power imbalances and potential conflicts of interest. The documented cases of fraud and abuse lend some weight to their call for more robust, independent oversight.
Okay, so reflecting on all this, Chelmsford stands as this really stark, disturbing example. Harmful practices, tragedy.
A total failure of the systems meant to protect patients. DST, ECT abuse.
Yeah.
It exposed massive gaps.
It really was a critical turning point, certainly in Australia. Showed the potential for devastation when treatments aren't evidence-based, lack oversight, and don't prioritize patient safety.
Absolutely.
And then you have CCHR emerging partly from that history, fueled by this broader skepticism.
And remaining a very vocal force questioning current practices, pushing for more scrutiny, less invasive treatments, rethinking diagnosis and drug reliance.
They definitely see their mission as a direct response to things like Chelmsford and what they view as ongoing problems, advocating for a system they see as more rights-respecting, less biological and pharma-focused.
Right, focus more on underlying causes of distress as they see it.
So this deep dive into Chelmsford and CCHR's mission, it really leaves us with some big questions for our listeners to think about. You know, given that tragic history and the concerns still being raised today, what are the best ways to ensure patient safety and ethical treatment in mental health? What checks and balances do we really need?
And how can individuals get more informed, more empowered to advocate for responsible, humane care?
Good questions. We definitely encourage everyone to look deeper into the sources, keep exploring this complex, really important topic. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.